The VIP lounge on the high floor of the Grand Hyatt was completely quiet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling window, the skyline of New York was soaked in rain. Alexander Grant sat on the sofa, holding a glass of ice water. He didn't look at the rain. His eyes were fixed on the tablet screen resting on the table. On the screen was a live stream of the Vance Group's 30th anniversary gala. The ballroom was packed with high society figures, investors, and news outlets. Cameras flashed continuously, catching every detail of the extravagant setup. At the center of the main stage stood Vivian Vance. She wore an emerald silk evening gown that hugged her figure, her diamond necklace reflecting the harsh stage lights. Standing half a step behind her was Julian Reed, her personal secretary. Julian wore a tailored navy suit and smiled with polished confidence, occasionally adjusting Vivian's microphone or leaning down to whisper something in her ear. "Look at them," Carter muttered, standing beside Alexander with a phone pressed to his ear. "She didn't even wait for your flight to land. She moved the stream forward by an hour." Alexander didn't answer. He adjusted his cufflink with a calm, deliberate motion. "Turn up the audio." Carter tapped the tablet screen. Vivian's clear, sharp voice filled the quiet room. "Tonight is a historic moment for Vance Group," Vivian said into the microphone, sweeping her eyes across the packed room. "For 30 years, my family built this empire. But a company cannot survive on past glory. It needs fresh vision and unwavering loyalty." She paused, turning slightly to look at Julian. Julian stepped forward, offering her a subtle nod. "Many of you have asked about the future leadership of Vance Group," Vivian continued, her voice rising with absolute certainty. "And more importantly, the future of the Vance family lineage. Today, I am proud to share two major announcements with our shareholders, our partners, and the millions watching live." She placed a gentle, deliberate hand over her lower abdomen. The crowd gasped. Camera shutters clattered like gunfire. "I am pregnant," Vivian announced, a tight, triumphant smile touching her lips. "And this child, the sole heir to the Vance legacy, belongs to the man who has stood by my side through every crisis. My partner, Julian Reed." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to push their microphones closer to the stage. Whispers broke out among the board members seated in the front row. On screen, Julian smiled warmly, placing his hand over Vivian's hand on her waist. The intimacy was shameless, executed perfectly for the cameras. Standing near the edge of the stage, Vivian's mother, Eleanor Vance, froze. Her face turned pale as she stared at her daughter in utter disbelief. She tried to step toward the stage, but a security guard politely blocked her path. Vivian ignored her mother completely. She raised a hand to quiet the room, her expression turning ice cold as she addressed the central camera. "I know what you are all thinking," Vivian said, her tone dripping with casual disdain. "What about my legal husband, Alexander Grant?" She let out a short, scoffing laugh that echoed through the speakers. "3 years ago, out of respect for my late father's wishes, I agreed to a marriage with Alexander. But respect does not excuse incompetence. For 3 years, Alexander has lived off my family's wealth. He has contributed nothing to this company, offered no strategic value, and proven himself to be nothing more than an obedient, useless house husband." Julian stepped up to the second microphone, adding with a smooth, sympathetic fake smile, "Alexander is a gentle man, but Vance Group requires a leader, not a dependent. We wish him the best in his future endeavors outside of our circle." Effective immediately, Vivian declared, pulling a signed document from her folder, "I have filed for a unilateral divorce on the grounds of marital breakdown. Alexander Grant has been removed from all Vance Group properties. Security has already packed his personal belongings from the estate. He leaves with what he brought in. Nothing." The stream was instantly flooded with millions of comments. "Serves him right. A parasite getting kicked out." Julian and Vivian looked so powerful together. Imagine getting dumped on live television across the entire country. In the quiet hotel lounge, Carter looked at Alexander, his jaw tight with anger. "Boss, she's out of her mind. She thinks she built Vance Group on her own. Every major bailout, every offshore contract you arranged behind the scenes." "Carter," Alexander interrupted smoothly. His voice was level, almost gentle. "Sir? How long until the market closes?" 3 minutes, sir." Alexander picked up his glass of ice water, took a slow sip, and set it down without making a sound. Execute the transfer, Alexander said quietly. Let's see how much her empire is worth without my shadow. Understood, Mr. Grant. Carter immediately brought up his encrypted terminal, his fingers flying across the keypads. Authorizing Grant Financial Holdings. Releasing 56% voting shares of Vance Group. Executing hostile takeover override. Now, on the tablet screen, Vivian was just finishing her closing remarks, her head held high like a queen receiving her crown. Thank you all, Vivian said, raising her glass. To the new era of Vance Group. Before the applause could fully build, Vivian's chief executive assistant burst onto the stage. He didn't care about the cameras or the live broadcast. His face was devoid of color, his knees visibly shaking as he stumbled toward Vivian. Miss Vance. The assistant gasped into his open lapel mic, his frantic voice broadcasting directly into the live feed. Stop. Stop the broadcast right now. Vivian frowned, her eyes flashing with annoyance as she pulled away from his reach. What are you doing? Pull yourself together. We are live. It's the board. It's the stock exchange. The assistant's voice cracked with pure panic, holding up a tablet with a red alert flashing across the screen. 3 minutes ago, an undisclosed entity bought up all floating debt and converted preferred shares. The ownership structure just flipped. Julian's smile vanished instantly. He grabbed the assistant's collar. What are you talking about? Vivian owns 40%. Nobody can override her. Not anymore. The assistant cried out, his voice echoing across the ballroom and through the live stream. A notice just hit the SEC. The new majority shareholder holds 56% of total voting power. They just issued an emergency freeze on all corporate decisions, asset transfers, and executive announcements. Vivian's face drained of all color. The smug triumph in her eyes turned into instant, blinding confusion. Who? Who bought the shares? The assistant looked at the screen, his lips trembling as he read the name aloud. Grant Global Holdings. Vivian blinked, taking a step back as if she had been slapped. Grant? What Grant? Before she could process the name, her personal phone in her clutch bag began to ring violently. She snatched it out, seeing an encrypted caller ID. Thinking it was her legal team, she picked it up instantly, her voice tight and aggressive. Who is this? What kind of joke are you playing with Vance Group stock? Through the receiver, Alexander's voice came through, calm, cold, and entirely unfamiliar to her. Congratulations on the pregnancy, Vivian, Alexander said softly. Enjoy the party. I'll see you at the board meeting tomorrow morning at 9. The ballroom of the Grand Hyatt was dead silent for 3 full seconds after Alexander hung up the phone. Then came the flashbulbs. A wave of blinding light exploded from the press gallery as every camera in the room focused on Vivian's pale, frozen face. Miss Vance, is it true? A reporter from Bloomberg shouted, shoving a microphone past the security barrier. Has Vance Group been targeted in a hostile takeover? Did Grant Global Holdings just block your executive authority? Another reporter yelled. Who is behind Grant Global? Vivian's hand was shaking so violently she nearly dropped her phone. She stared at the black screen, her mind racing. Alexander? No, that's impossible. Alexander was just a quiet, jobless orphan her father had brought into the family. He spent his days managing their estate, booking her travel, and quietly cooking her meals. He didn't own shares. He didn't own anything. Cut the feed. Julian roared, stepping in front of Vivian and pointing aggressively at the media crew. Cut the live stream right now. Security, clear the stage. It's too late, Mr. Reed. The chief executive assistant stammered, holding up his tablet. The stream is broadcast through 3 major networks. Over 8 million people just saw the SEC filing alert live. Julian turned back to Vivian, his polished composure completely cracking. Vivian, what is this? Who is Grant Global Holdings? Did your father set up a secret trust behind your back? I don't know, Vivian whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing noise in the room. My father left everything to me. I hold 40% of the voting shares. Nobody can override 40% unless someone bought up every single floating share, converted the preferred debt, and consolidated the minority board blocks, Eleanor Vance said, stepping onto the stage. Her mother's voice was sharp, cutting through the panic. She looked at Vivian with a mix of anger and profound disappointment. And someone just did. In less than 3 minutes. Mother, Calm down, Vivian snapped, trying to regain her executive composure. She straightened her posture and adjusted her microphone, though her knuckles were white. This is just a cheap scare tactic by some predatory hedge fund. They saw a moment of transition and tried to manipulate the market. My legal team will handle it. Your legal team can't override 56% voting power, Vivian, Eleanor said, lowering her voice so the nearby microphones wouldn't catch it. Who was that on the phone just now? I saw your face. Who called you? Vivian hesitated, her jaw tightening. It was Alexander. Julian let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. Alexander? That useless house husband? What does he have to do with this? He's probably calling to beg for his allowance now that you kicked him out. Shut up, Julian. Vivian flared, her nerves completely shot. She turned away from him and dialed Alexander's number back immediately. The subscriber you are trying to reach is currently unavailable, the automated voice chimed in her ear. She pressed red, dialed again, and got the same result. He had blocked her number. Damn it. Vivian swore under her breath, her chest heaving. She rapidly pulled up the contact for Carter, Alexander's supposed friend, who occasionally drove him around. This time, the call went through on the second ring. Carter, Vivian demanded, dropping all formality. Where's Alexander? Put him on the phone right now. What kind of stunt is he pulling? Good evening, Miss Vance. Carter's voice came through the speaker, crisp, professional, and entirely unbothered. Or should I say, former Chief Executive Vance. Don't play games with me, Carter. Vivian hissed, stepping into a side corner of the stage away from the reporters. Did Alexander leak internal company documents to a rival fund? Is that how Grant Global executed this trade? If he leaked confidential data to sabotage my announcement, I will destroy him in court. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. Carter chuckled softly over the line, a sound that sent an unexpected chill down Vivian's spine. Miss Vance, Mr. Grant doesn't need to leak your company's documents, Carter said smoothly. He owns them. All of them. What the hell is that supposed to mean? It means exactly what the SEC filing says, Carter replied, his tone turning ice cold. At 3:58 p.m., Grant Global Holdings exercised its option to convert $12 billion in senior secured debt into equity. Combining that with the open market acquisitions completed over the last 72 hours, Mr. Grant now controls 56% of Vance Group. Vivian felt the air leave her lungs. $12 billion in debt. Vance Group's offshore debt was held by a private Swiss syndicate. And who do you think funded that syndicate 3 years ago when your father's company was weeks away from bankruptcy? Carter asked quietly. Your father didn't save Vance Group on his own, Miss Vance. Alexander did, on the condition that his name remain off the books until he chose otherwise. Vivian stood frozen, her mind refusing to connect the dots. No, that's absurd. Alexander doesn't have $12 billion. He doesn't have $12,000. He lived in my house. He drove the car I paid for. He let you think that because he cared about your pride, Carter said flatly, and because he promised your late father he would protect you until you were ready to lead. Clearly, that trust was misplaced. Julian rushed over, grabbing the phone out of Vivian's hand and putting it on speaker. Listen to me, you fake corporate mouthpiece. Julian snapped into the mic. I don't know what kind of financial fraud you and Alexander are pulling, but I am the newly appointed executive heir of Vance Group. If you don't reverse this unauthorized trade by tomorrow morning, our legal department will file an emergency injunction and freeze every account associated with your fake fund. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Who is speaking? Carter asked mildly. Julian Reed, Senior Vice President and future Managing Director. Julian declared, puffing out his chest for the benefit of the watching board members nearby. Mr. Reed, Carter said, his voice dripping with mild amusement. Thank you for identifying yourself. Mr. Grant has a message specifically for you. Julian sneered. Tell him to come say it to my face if he has the guts. Oh, he will, Carter replied. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, during the emergency board meeting at Vance Group headquarters. Mr. Grant will personally preside over the meeting as the new chairman of the board. The security team has already been updated with the new access protocols. If you or Miss Vance attempt to remove a single file, hard drive, or asset from the building tonight, you will be arrested on the spot. You can't do that. Vivian screamed, grabbing the phone back. This is my family's company. My father built this. Your father built it. Miss Vance, Carter said coldly. You just handed it away. Have a good evening. The call disconnected. Vivian stared at the phone as the line went dead. Around her, the ballroom was in utter chaos. Board members were shouting at executives, shareholders were frantically calling their brokers, and the reporters were writing headlines that would dominate every financial outlet in the world by morning. Julian grabbed Vivian's arm, his fingers digging in tightly. Vivian, do something. Call the board. Call the bank. We can't let him walk into headquarters tomorrow like he owns the place. Vivian looked at Julian, seeing a flicker of ugly panic in his eyes that she had never noticed before. Then she looked down at her phone, remembering the calm, icy voice of the man she had just publicly humiliated. For the first time in 3 years, Vivian felt a knot of pure terror form in her stomach. The private G650 jet soared through the night sky, cutting through the heavy storm clouds on its approach to New York. Inside the main cabin, Alexander sat at the sleek mahogany desk, a single glass of scotch resting beside a stack of financial reports. On the large bulkhead screen opposite him, news anchors on CNBC were dissecting the evening's events in real time. A historic evening of corporate chaos for Vance Group, the lead anchor reported, as images of Vivian and Julian on stage flashed across the screen. What was supposed to be a celebratory anniversary gala turned into an abrupt power struggle when an offshore entity, Grant Global Holdings, executed a surprise debt-to-equity conversion, seizing 56% control of the multinational conglomerate. Carter walked in from the cockpit area, placing a tablet on Alexander's desk. The board members are panicking, boss. 5 of the independent directors have already sent emergency emails attempting to establish contact with Grant Global. They're terrified of a total liquidation. Let them panic, Alexander said, his voice quiet and even. He didn't look up from the report. Panic forces clarity. They've spent 3 years approving Vivian's reckless expansion plans just to stay on her good side. And Miss Vance? Carter asked. She's currently at the corporate residence. Security reported that she tried to enter your private study an hour ago, but the lock codes were already changed. Alexander's hand paused over the paper. A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. She's looking for answers she should have found 3 years ago. He looked out the oval window at the distant city lights below. 3 years ago, Richard Vance, Vivian's father and Alexander's mentor, lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to life support. The old man had grabbed Alexander's wrist with his remaining strength, pleading with tears in his eyes. Alexander, Vance Group is bleeding, Richard had whispered back then. My board is full of vultures, and Vivian. Vivian is too arrogant to see the traps they've set for her. Protect her. Protect my company. But don't give her everything at once. If she doesn't learn humility, she will destroy herself. To honor that dying wish, Alexander had stepped down from the active management of Grant Financial, his family's multi-billion-dollar global investment firm, and entered Vivian's life as a modest, quiet partner. He took care of the estate, managed her schedule, and quietly absorbed her daily frustration. Whenever Vance Group faced a critical cash flow crisis, Alexander worked through the night in his locked study, directing Grant Global to anonymously purchase Vance Group's distressed debt, keeping the company afloat while letting Vivian take full public credit for every miraculous turnaround. He had given her 3 years to grow, to see past her own ego, and to build a real partnership with him. Instead, she had brought her ex-boyfriend into the executive suite, handed him corporate credit, and capped it off by announcing her pregnancy on national television while stripping Alexander of his dignity. Boss, Carter's voice brought him back to the present. We just received the forensic audit on the accounts Julian Reed managed over the last 18 months. What did you find? It's worse than we thought, Carter said, pulling up a series of wire transfers on his tablet. Julian didn't just mismanage funds. He's been funneling capital into shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. He's diverted over $40 million under the guise of marketing consultancies. And Vivian signed off on every single invoice without looking. She was too busy listening to his flattery to check the balance sheets, Alexander noted coldly. Do we hand the audit directly to the SEC tomorrow? Carter asked. No, Alexander replied, closing the file in front of him. If we file criminal charges tonight, the stock plunges 40% at market open, and 10,000 low-level employees lose their pensions. We handle it in the boardroom first. I want Julian stripped of his title, his assets, and his freedom, in that exact order. Understood, Carter said. And Miss Vance? Alexander picked up his glass, the amber liquid catching the soft light of the cabin. Vivian thinks I'm a doormat because I chose to stand behind her. Tomorrow, she learns what happens when the foundation steps away. Meanwhile, in the Grand Master Suite of the Vance estate, Vivian was throwing folders across the floor. Where are they? She screamed, her hair disheveled, her evening gown replaced by a silk robe. He kept all his personal records in this desk. Where are his bank statements? His tax filings? His family documents? Julian stood near the fireplace, pouring himself a third glass of bourbon. His hands were shaking. Vivian, stop looking for paper. It doesn't matter what he kept in this room. We need to focus on tomorrow morning. If Grant Global takes the chairman's seat, my executive appointment is dead. Shut up for a second, Julian. Vivian snapped, turning on him with sharp eyes. Do you realize what's happening? Alexander didn't have a job. He didn't have an income. Every month, I transferred $10,000 into his personal account for household expenses. How does a man like that buy 56% of Vance Group? He didn't buy it. Julian insisted, pacing nervously. He's a front man. Someone is using him. Think about it. Vivian, he was a nobody when your father brought him in. Some hedge fund probably approached him, offered him a couple $1,000,000 to use his name and his marriage status to launch a hostile takeover. Vivian stopped, staring at the empty wall safe behind the painting she had just pulled down. A front man? She whispered, trying to convince herself. Yes, that makes sense. He's working for a competitor. He's doing this out of revenge because I divorced him. Exactly, Julian said, rushing over and grabbing her shoulders. He's bitter. He knows he's getting kicked out, so he sold out your father's company to the highest bidder. We present that exact theory to the board tomorrow. We tell them Alexander is committing corporate espionage. Vivian looked down at the floor, where a small black leather notebook lay near the baseboard. It had fallen out from behind the desk drawer. She knelt down and picked it up. It was Alexander's handwriting, neat, precise, and disciplined. She flipped to the last written page, dated just 3 days ago. Vance Group Q2 debt obligation, $450 million. Refinanced via Grant Syndicate at 1.2% interest. Vivian's strategic expansion in Chicago is failing due to poor inventory management by Jay Reid. Absorb losses privately. Remind personal chef about Vivian's allergy to shellfish before the anniversary dinner. Vivian's breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the page, her fingers tightening around the leather cover. Absorb losses privately? What is that? Julian asked, stepping closer to look over her shoulder. Is it a ledger? Vivian slammed the notebook shut, pulling it close to her chest. Her heart was beating violently against her ribs. For the first time, a dark, terrifying suspicion crept into her mind. A thought so absurd, so massive, that her brain actively fought against it. What if Alexander wasn't the parasite living off her wealth? What if she was the one living in his world all along? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was an automated calendar reminder set for 8 a.m. the next morning. Emergency board meeting, Vance Group HQ, floor 50. Attendance mandatory. Vivian swallowed hard, looking at her reflection in the dark window pane. Get the legal team on the line, Julian. Tell them to prepare for war. The 50th floor of Vance Group headquarters was packed. By 8:45 a.m., all 14 members of the board of directors were seated around the massive oval conference table. The air was thick with tension. Phones buzzed continuously, and low, anxious conversations filled the room as members reviewed the morning's frantic stock market reports. At the head of the table sat Vivian Vance. She had traded her silk gown for a sharp, tailored black pantsuit, her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. Beside her stood Julian, holding a thick leather folder, looking confident despite the dark circles under his eyes. Everyone, please quiet down, Vivian announced, her voice projected with absolute authority. She leaned forward, placing her hands on the table. I know last night's market activity caused unnecessary panic. But let me assure you, Vance Group remains entirely under our control. Our legal team has already drafted an emergency injunction against Grant Global Holdings for market manipulation. An elderly board member, Richard's longtime associate Thomas Hayes, scoffed loudly. An injunction? Vivian, Grant Global holds 56% of our voting shares. They bought out our senior debt. They aren't manipulating the market. They own the market. They are a rogue offshore entity using a proxy to destabilize us. Julian chimed in, stepping closer to the table and tapping his folder. We have reason to believe this entire scheme is being orchestrated by Alexander Grant, a disgruntled ex-spouse attempting to extort this board following his pending divorce. Extort you? Thomas sneered, looking at Julian with utter contempt. Alexander was Richard's chosen son-in-law. He's lived quietly for 3 years while you've been spending company money on overseas consultants. If Alexander is behind this, I'd trust him over you any day. That's enough, Thomas. Vivian snapped, her eyes flashing. Alexander is a jobless nobody. He doesn't have the capital, the brainpower, or the network to pull off a multi-billion-dollar takeover. He's being used as a frontman by our competitors, and if you side with him, you are committing treason against this company. Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the boardroom clicked open. Treason, Vivian? That's a heavy word for a Tuesday morning. The entire room went dead silent. Heads snapped toward the entrance. Alexander Grant walked into the room. He was dressed in an immaculate, bespoke charcoal suit, his dark hair styled back, his stride relaxed yet commanding. Gone was the quiet, modest man who usually stood 3 steps behind Vivian at public events. In his eyes was a sharp, piercing coldness that made several board members instinctively hold their breath. Flanking him were 6 high-powered corporate attorneys, followed by Carter, who carried a sleek aluminum briefcase. Behind them stood Arthur Vance, the venerable, retired chief counsel who had served Vivian's father for 30 years. Arthur? Vivian gasped, her composure instantly fracturing. What are you doing here? You retired 2 years ago. I came out of retirement for my ultimate duty to Richard. Vivian, Arthur said coldly, pulling out a chair at the far end of the table for Alexander. To ensure the right man leads this company. Alexander sat down at the head position opposite Vivian, crossing his legs casually. He looked around the room, resting his gaze on Vivian for a brief second before ignoring her completely. Good morning, members of the board, Alexander said, his voice deep, clear, and perfectly calm. Let's skip the pleasantries. We have a long agenda today. Julian slammed his folder onto the table, pointing an accusing finger at Alexander. Security. Why is security letting him in here? Alexander, you don't belong in this room. You've been served with divorce papers and removed from all Vance properties. Get the hell out before I have you arrested for trespassing. Carter stepped forward, opening his briefcase and pulling out a stack of pristine legal documents. He slid them smoothly down the center of the table. Mr. Reed, I suggest you lower your voice and check the SEC filings, Carter said with a dry, dangerous smile. As of 9 a.m. Eastern Time, Grant Global Holdings has officially registered its 56% controlling interest. Mr. Alexander Grant is the founder, CEO, and sole owner of Grant Global Holdings. The room erupted into shocked murmurs. Vivian stood up so fast her heavy leather chair rolled back into the glass wall. That's a lie. That's impossible. You don't own Grant Global. Where would you get that kind of money? Alexander slowly turned his head toward her. His expression was completely blank, devoid of the warmth or tenderness he had shown her for 3 years. Where did I get the money, Vivian? Alexander asked softly. My family founded Grant Financial 40 years ago. Before I married you, I managed $80 billion in assets across London, New York, and Singapore. My father built the foundation. I built the empire. Vivian felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her feet. Her hands began to tremble. No, no. If you were rich, why did you live in my house? Why did you let me pay for everything? Why did you pretend to be useless? Because your father begged me to keep a low profile so your ego wouldn't feel threatened, Alexander replied flatly. He wanted you to learn how to run a business without depending on a man. I honored his wish. I stayed in the background, absorbed your company's debts through my private funds, and gave you the stage to shine. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table and resting his chin on his interlaced fingers. And how did you repay that discretion? By parading your secretary into my home, handing him executive power, and announcing your pregnancy on national television to humiliate me. The board members looked between Alexander and Vivian in absolute shock. The pieces were finally falling into place. Alexander, Vivian stammered, her voice cracking. The high and mighty CEO persona was crumbling rapidly. I didn't know. You never told me. You never asked, Alexander interrupted sharply. He turned his attention to Carter. Carter, item number 1 on the agenda. Yes, Mr. Chairman, Carter said, pulling a red folder from his bag. Item number 1. The immediate termination and asset freeze of Senior Vice President Julian Reed. Julian's face turned paper white. What? You can't fire me. Vivian appointed me. Vivian doesn't hold the voting power anymore. Julian, Alexander said, his eyes locking onto Julian like a predator watching its prey. And as for your appointment, we just finished a full forensic audit of your department. Alexander motioned with his hand, and one of his attorneys handed out copies of the audit to every board member. Over the last 18 months, Julian Reed has embezzled $42 million from Vance Group through fake offshore consulting firms, Alexander announced, his voice ringing through the room like a gavel. Every single transaction was signed off by Vivian Vance without verification. Thomas Hayes slapped the audit report onto the table, glaring at Vivian and Julian in pure rage. $42 million. Is this true, Vivian? I. Vivian looked at Julian, her eyes wide with shock and horror. Julian? What is he talking about? You said those consultancies were for the Chicago expansion. Julian backed away from the table, sweat popping out on his forehead. It's a frame-up. He forged those documents. Vivian, you have to believe me. The FBI and the SEC are waiting downstairs in the lobby, Mr. Reed, Arthur Vance added smoothly, holding up his phone. They have the full paper trail, complete with your Swiss bank account numbers. Julian dropped his folder, turned around, and bolted for the boardroom doors. But before he could touch the handle, 2 armed federal agents opened the doors from the outside, stepping into the room and blocking his path. Julian Reed? The lead agent asked, producing a pair of handcuffs. You're under arrest for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. Vivian, help me. Call the lawyers. Julian screamed as the agents grabbed his arms, forcing him to his knees and clicking the cuffs around his wrists. Vivian, tell them I did it for us. Vivian stood frozen, staring at the man she had chosen over her husband. She didn't say a word. She couldn't even breathe. As the agents dragged a sobbing Julian out of the boardroom, Alexander slowly stood up from his chair. He buttoned his suit jacket, looking down at Vivian with terrifying detachment. Item number 2, Alexander said quietly to the silent room. The immediate removal of Vivian Vance as Chief Executive Officer of Vance Group. The boardroom remained dead silent as the echo of Alexander's voice lingered in the air. Vivian stood paralyzed at the head of the long table, staring at Alexander as if seeing him for the very first time. The man who used to prepare her morning coffee and wait patiently in the lobby for hours after her late meetings was now looking down at her like a judge passing a final sentence. You're removing me? Vivian's voice was barely a whisper. Alexander, this is my family's legacy. My father gave me this company. Your father built this company. Vivian, Alexander corrected her, his tone devoid of any emotion. And in less than 3 years, you handed $42 million to a con man and brought us to the brink of insolvency. You didn't manage this company, you played house with it. Thomas Hayes stepped forward, placing his copy of the forensic audit onto the table. I second the motion to remove Vivian Vance as Chief Executive Officer immediately. Her gross negligence has exposed Vance Group to catastrophic legal and financial liabilities. I third the motion, another senior director added without hesitation. We cannot allow a CEO who signed off on fraudulent transfers to remain in charge for another minute. Wait. All of you wait. Vivian pleaded, her eyes darting frantically across the faces of the board members who had toasted her success just 24 hours ago. None of them would meet her gaze. I was tricked. Julian faked those invoices. I didn't know he was stealing from the company. Ignorance is not a defense for a CEO, Miss Vance, Arthur Vance chimed in, his legal tone sharp and uncompromising. By signing those wire transfers without basic due diligence, you breached your fiduciary duty to the shareholders. Mr. Grant has every legal right under the corporate charter to strip your executive powers today. Alexander didn't waste another second arguing. He picked up his pen, signed the executive order sitting on the table, and handed it to Carter. The motion is passed, Alexander declared coldly. Effective immediately, Vivian Vance is stripped of all executive authority, voting proxy, and corporate benefits. Security will escort her from the executive suite. Vivian felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. Tears of humiliation and anger finally welled in her eyes. She stepped toward Alexander, reaching out to touch his arm, but Carter immediately stepped in between them, blocking her path. "Alexander, please," Vivian sobbed, dropping all her former pride. "We were married for 3 years. How can you do this to me in front of everyone? We can talk about this in private. I'll fire Julian. I'll reverse the divorce papers. Just don't take the company from me." Alexander looked at her hand resting on Carter's arm, then met her eyes. His gaze was so icy it made her freeze in her tracks. "You divorced me on national television yesterday, Vivian," Alexander said softly. "You paraded your lover and your child in front of millions of viewers to destroy my dignity. Did you care about our 3 years then? I was wrong." Vivian cried out, shaking her head frantically. "Julian manipulated me. He told me you were holding me back, that you were just a freeloading burden. And you believed him because it fed your ego." Alexander cut her off sharply. "You wanted to be the brilliant, self-made female tycoon who saved Vance Group all by herself. You couldn't tolerate the idea that a quiet husband was the one keeping your world intact." He turned away from her, addressing the rest of the board. "I am appointing Carter as interim chief operating officer," Alexander ordered. "Our legal team will initiate recovery proceedings against Julian Reed's offshore accounts. Market operations will resume as scheduled at 10 a.m. "Yes, Mr. Chairman." The board members responded in unison, bowing their heads in complete submission. Two uniformed female security officers entered the boardroom, stepping up to Vivian's side. "Miss Vance, please come with us quietly. Your personal items have been boxed and moved to the lobby." "Don't touch me," Vivian screamed, pulling away from the guards. She stared at Alexander's back as he walked toward his new corner office. "Alexander, you can't just throw me out. I am a Vance. This company has my name on it." Alexander stopped near the threshold of his office. He didn't turn around. "The Vance name built the building, Vivian," Alexander said, his voice quiet, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "My money paid the mortgage. And as of today, the mortgage is settled." With a crisp click, the heavy oak doors of the chairman's office closed behind him, shutting Vivian out completely. The security guards gripped Vivian's arms firmly, guiding her toward the private elevator. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the polished chrome walls. Her hair was messy, her eyes were bloodshot, and her black designer suit looked empty and hollow. Down in the main lobby, news crews had already gathered behind the security turnstiles. The moment the elevator doors opened and Vivian stepped out flanked by security, a barrage of flashbulbs exploded in her face. "Miss Vance, have you been officially ousted by Alexander Grant? Is it true that your secretary was arrested for embezzling $40 million? What happens to the Vance family legacy now?" Vivian pulled her coat over her face, stumbling over her own heels as she tried to push past the reporters. She looked around for her executive driver, but the Blacktown car was nowhere to be found. "Your corporate lease on the vehicle was canceled 15 minutes ago, Miss Vance," her former assistant whispered, rushing past her with a box of her own belongings. "I'm sorry. I have to go." Standing alone on the wet sidewalk outside the skyscraper that used to bear her family's proud legacy, Vivian clutched her handbag to her chest. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a push notification from the Wall Street Journal. "Breaking: Vance Group stock surges 35% following hostile takeover by financial titan Alexander Grant. Former CEO Vivian Vance ousted amid fraud scandal." Vivian dropped her phone onto the cold pavement, the screen shattering into a dozen pieces. She sank to her knees right on the sidewalk, the rain soaking through her expensive pantsuit, as she finally realized the terrifying truth. Her world hadn't just fallen apart. She had destroyed it with her own hands. 3 days after the boardroom coup, the rain in New York hadn't stopped. Vivian stood across the street from the Vance Group headquarters, shivering under a cheap black umbrella she had bought at a subway station. Her credit cards had been frozen by the corporate court order, and her personal bank accounts were under temporary freeze pending the completion of the forensic audit. The glittering life she had taken for granted, the penthouses, the private drivers, the endless credit lines, had vanished overnight. A convoy of sleek black Suburbans pulled up to the private VIP entrance of the building. Security guards in dark suits quickly opened umbrella canopy lines, creating a secure walkway from the vehicle to the lobby doors. Alexander stepped out of the lead vehicle. He wore a tailored navy coat, flanked by Carter and a striking, elegant woman in a camel wool suit, Serena Sterling, the managing director of Sterling Global, one of Wall Street's most powerful private equity firms. Serena was laughing at something Alexander said, her body language full of professional admiration and easy confidence. Vivian's heart hammered in her chest. She dropped her umbrella and sprinted across the rain-slicked street, pushing past the outer barricade before the security detail could react. Alexander! Vivian screamed, her voice hoarse from days of crying. Alexander, stop! Please! The guards immediately stepped in, intercepting her before she could get within 10 feet of him. Ma'am, step back, a guard commanded, shoving her shoulder. Let me go? That's my husband. Vivian shouted desperately, struggling against the guard's grip. Alexander, look at me. Alexander stopped near the glass doors. He slowly turned around, his expression completely unbothered. He didn't rush over, nor did he look angry. He simply looked at her the way one might look at an inconvenient delay in a schedule. Serena paused beside him, glancing at Vivian with mild curiosity. Is this the former CEO, Alexander? Yes, Alexander said quietly. He signaled to the security team. Let her speak. The guards released their grip, but remained standing between them. Vivian stumbled forward, her hair soaked, her mascara smudged down her cheeks, looking pathetic compared to the polished people surrounding her. Alexander, please, Vivian choked out, taking a shuddering breath. I went to the house. The locks were changed. My lawyer said you bought the estate through a land trust 4 years ago. You owned everything, the house, the land, the cars, all of it. It was my personal property long before I met you. Vivian, Alexander said, his voice dropping an octave, steady and cold. I allowed you to live there because you were my wife. I am still your wife. Vivian cried, taking a step closer. The divorce paperwork wasn't finalized by a judge. We can throw it away. We can start over. Serena let out a quiet, elegant laugh, shaking her head as she checked her watch. I'll head up to the boardroom, Mr. Grant. We have the Asia-Pacific merger contract ready for your signature. I'll be up in a minute, Serena, Alexander replied smoothly. As Serena walked into the private elevator, Vivian felt a wave of toxic jealousy and panic hit her. Who is she? Vivian demanded, her voice cracking. Are you replacing me with her? Is that why you did this? Alexander took a slow step toward Vivian. The air between them felt freezing. I didn't do anything to you, Vivian, Alexander said, looking down at her. You replaced yourself. You stood on a stage in front of millions of people, put your hand on Julian's arm, and told the world I was a useless parasite. I was stupid. Julian lied to me. Vivian wept, trying to grab Alexander's hand, but he pulled his arm back with casual disgust. He told me he was the one fixing the financial reports. He made me believe you were just lazy. I swear, Alexander, if I had known who you really were, I never would have listened to him. Alexander stared at her, a bitter, ironic smile touching his lips. Read that sentence back to yourself, Vivian, Alexander said softly. If you had known who I really was. That's the core of your problem, isn't it? You only value people based on their title, their wealth, and what they can do for your ego. If I were just a quiet, average man who loved you and took care of your home, you felt entitled to walk all over me. No, that's not true. It is true. Alexander cut her off sharply, his tone dropping all warmth. When I had nothing in your eyes, I was trash to be discarded on live television. Now that you know I own the ground you're standing on, you're on your knees begging for forgiveness. That isn't love, Vivian. That's desperation. Alexander, I'm pregnant. Vivian blurted out, using her last remaining weapon. You heard me at the gala. What about the baby? Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, a terrifying flash of dominance passing through his gaze before returning to complete calm. I received the medical records from your doctor yesterday, Vivian, Alexander said flatly. Julian paid off the clinic director to forge a positive test result to force your hand into naming him partner. You aren't pregnant. You never were. Vivian froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her blood ran completely cold as the final layer of her lies was stripped away. He He lied about that too? She whispered, her knees trembling. You didn't even bother to check your own medical report before using it to humiliate me, Alexander said, taking a step back toward the doors. Julian is facing 20 years in federal prison for grand larceny. And as for you, my legal team has finalized the divorce terms. You will receive a standard $2 million severance settlement from Vance Group, provided you sign the non-disclosure agreement and relinquish all claims to the Vance family name. $2 million. Vivian gasped, horrified. Vance Group is worth billions. My father built it. $2 million is more than you deserve after nearly bankrupting this company, Alexander said coldly. Sign the paper, Vivian. Because if you fight this in court, I will personally fund the prosecution of your fiduciary negligence until you don't even have enough money left to pay for that umbrella. Alexander, please, don't do this to me. Vivian threw herself onto the marble floor at his feet, grabbing the hem of his coat. I love you. I realize it now. I love you. Alexander looked down at her clinging to his shoes in the rain. There was no joy in his face, no smug triumph, only absolute, unshakable indifference. He gently, deliberately pulled his coat from her grip. I used to protect you because I chose to, Alexander said, turning his back on her as the glass sliding doors opened. Now, you don't even exist to me. Alexander, Vivian screamed as security stepped in, pulling her back onto the wet pavement. The heavy glass doors closed, shutting out her cries completely. Inside the warm, quiet lobby, Alexander adjusted his cuffs, stepped into the private elevator, and pressed the button for the 50th floor, never looking back. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan was filled with the world's elite. Foreign dignitaries, Wall Street Titan CEOs, and international media networks packed the venue for the annual Grant Global Economic Summit. On the center stage stood Alexander Grant. He was at the podium, addressing the room with effortlessly sharp authority. Behind him, massive digital screens displayed the real-time financial metrics of the newly restructured Grant Vance conglomerate. In 2 quarters, we didn't just stabilize Vance Group, Alexander announced into the microphone, his clear voice carrying across the silent hall. We cleared 60% of its legacy debt, restructured its supply chain across 5 continents, and integrated its technology sector into Grant Global's core infrastructure. Effective today, Vance Group is officially rebranded as Grant Tech International. The audience erupted into loud, respectful applause. In the front row, Serena Sterling smiled, raising her glass toward him. Next to her, Arthur Vance clapped proudly, a look of profound satisfaction on the old attorney's face. As for our future, Alexander continued, resting his hands casually on the podium. The Grant Foundation is committing $500 million to small business incubation across the state of New York, ensuring that real innovation is protected from predatory corporate mismanagement. Camera flashes lit up the stage in a continuous rhythm. Alexander finished his speech, shook hands with 2 visiting European ambassadors, and stepped down from the main platform. Carter met him at the edge of the stage, handing him an encrypted tablet. Market opening results just came in from London, boss. Grant Tech shares opened up 12%. Total market capitalization has crossed $50 billion. Good, Alexander said, taking a sip of sparkling water. Has the restructuring of the old Vance board been completed? Every single compromised director has been replaced by independent audits, Carter replied. And Julian Reed was sentenced this morning. Alexander paused slightly. What was the verdict? 18 years in federal penitentiary without parole for wire fraud and money laundering, Carter said with a dry nod. His defense team tried to bargain, but federal prosecutors didn't give him an inch after reviewing our forensic evidence. His assets have been seized to reimburse the company treasury. And Vivian? Alexander asked, his voice neutral, completely devoid of hatred or nostalgia. Carter opened a small folder on the tablet screen. She exhausted her remaining funds trying to sue for 50% equity of Vance Group. The federal court threw out her claim last week, citing the non-disclosure agreement she signed. After paying her legal fees, her severance money was practically wiped out. Carter slid a recent photo across the screen. It showed Vivian sitting in a small, cramped suburban apartment office, wearing a plain gray blouse, typing away on a second-hand laptop. Gone was the high society heiress who wore custom silk gowns and multi-carat diamond necklaces. She looked tired, pale, and entirely ordinary, working as a junior entry-level paralegal for a small traffic law firm. She tried to contact your personal secretary 3 times this week, Carter added. She asked if she could send you a letter for your birthday next month. Alexander looked at the photo on the screen for 3 seconds. His expression didn't change at all. Block her emails, Alexander said quietly. If she calls again, let the legal department handle it according to standard harassment protocols. Understood, Mr. Grant. Carter closed the tab immediately. Miss Sterling is waiting in the executive lounge. The signing ceremony for the European Green Energy acquisition starts in 10 minutes. I'm on my way, Alexander said. He walked past the grand floor-to-ceiling windows of the plaza, looking out over the sprawling, vibrant skyline of Central Park and Fifth Avenue. 3 years ago, he had chosen to live in the shadows, dimming his own light to support a woman who only saw him as a stepping stone. He had given her his patience, his protection, and his heart, only to be tossed aside the moment she believed she was untouchable. Now, the shadow was gone. The game was over. Alexander adjusted his coat, turned his back on the past forever, and walked into the VIP suite toward the future he had built with his own hands.